In this episode, we're going to talk about encryption in a way that goes beyond technical correctness and moves into the realities of pressure, investigations, and accountability. Many beginners think of encryption as a simple decision, like turning it on or choosing a stronger algorithm. But in real cloud environments, the hard questions show up later. When an incident happens, people will ask whether data was encrypted, who could decrypt it, whether keys might have been misused, and whether the organization can prove any of that with evidence. When legal or regulatory scrutiny appears, the questions become even more precise because decisions must be defendable, documented, and consistent with obligations. An encryption approach that looks good in a diagram can collapse under incident response if keys are poorly governed or if you cannot quickly restrict access without breaking critical systems. An approach can also fail legal scrutiny if the organization cannot demonstrate control over keys, retention of evidence, and clear ownership of sensitive decisions. The goal is to choose encryption approaches that remain strong and explainable when everything is stressful, which is a very different standard than simply being able to say encryption is enabled. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A practical way to define an encryption approach is the full set of design choices that determine how data is protected and how that protection is operated over time. That includes what gets encrypted, where encryption happens, how keys are managed, how access to keys is controlled, and what evidence is retained to prove the control is functioning. Survivability during incident response depends on operational clarity, meaning you can quickly understand key dependencies, restrict access safely, rotate keys when necessary, and confirm that the changes had the intended effect. Survivability during legal scrutiny depends on defensibility, meaning the approach follows a consistent policy, aligns with data sensitivity, and produces records that can be presented as proof without hand-waving. Beginners often focus only on the encryption mechanism itself, but the mechanism is just one layer. The operational and governance layers are what determine whether the approach holds up when challenged. An approach that cannot be explained or controlled under pressure is not truly protective, even if the data is technically encrypted. This is why the title emphasizes choosing approaches, not just enabling features. Incident response introduces a unique type of stress because time matters, uncertainty is high, and every action can have consequences for both security and availability. If an organization suspects credential compromise, it may need to revoke access quickly, including access to encryption keys, but it must do so without accidentally shutting down critical services. A survivable encryption approach, therefore, starts with key segmentation, because segmentation limits the blast radius of emergency actions. When keys are separated by environment, application, or data domain, responders can take targeted action, such as restricting key usage for a specific dataset, rather than triggering a broad outage by touching a shared key used by many systems. Segmentation also helps investigations because it allows you to narrow which data could be affected by misuse of a particular key. Without segmentation, incident response becomes a dangerous guessing game where responders may hesitate to act because the consequences are unclear. A well-chosen approach makes safe action possible because dependencies and boundaries are clear. Key governance is another aspect that determines survivability, because incident response often depends on quickly answering who can decrypt and who can change key policy. If key permissions are broad and unclear, it becomes hard to identify which identities might have been able to access sensitive data during the incident. If the same administrator roles can both change key policy and use keys, attackers can use a compromised admin identity to expand access and then cover their tracks. A survivable approach separates key administration from key usage and makes key roles tightly defined and regularly reviewed. That separation reduces the chance that a single compromised identity can both manipulate key rules and exploit them. It also reduces the uncertainty during response because there are fewer identities to investigate and fewer permission paths to consider. When governance is disciplined, Responders can move faster because the set of plausible misuse paths is smaller and more understandable. Evidence is the bridge between encryption claims and real accountability, and it is central to both incident response and legal scrutiny. During incident response, you need to determine whether keys were used in suspicious ways, whether sensitive data could have been decrypted, and what time period might be affected. That requires reliable key usage records that show which identity used which key and what operation was performed. During legal scrutiny, you may need to show that encryption was in place at the time, that key access was controlled, and that evidence has integrity, meaning it was not altered after the fact. A survivable encryption approach, therefore, includes evidence retention and protection as part of the design, not as an optional extra. It also includes clarity about what evidence exists and how long it is kept, because legal and regulatory questions often reach back weeks or months. If evidence is missing, the organization may be forced to assume worst-case exposure, which can increase legal risk and response cost. The approach that survives scrutiny is the one that can answer questions with records, not with confidence. Another critical design choice is how encryption is applied across the data lifecycle, because incidents and legal inquiries often focus on copies of data rather than the primary system. Backups, exports, logs, caches, and replicas may contain sensitive data and may be stored for long periods, which increases both value and risk. If only the primary data store is encrypted while backups are not protected consistently, an attacker may target backups as an easier path, and an investigation may later reveal that the most exposed copy was outside the main control. A survivable approach treats secondary data copies as first-class assets, requiring encryption and clear key ownership for backups and archives. It also ensures that data movement does not create temporary plaintext exposure during migrations or troubleshooting. Legal scrutiny often asks whether data was protected wherever it existed, not only in its main location. An incident response often needs to identify all places where sensitive data could have been accessed. A robust approach includes mechanisms and processes that keep encryption consistent across lifecycle stages, so you do not discover gaps only after an event. Choosing encryption approaches also involves deciding where encryption happens, because the location of encryption affects who can access data and what evidence you can produce. Some encryption occurs at the storage layer, protecting data at rest, while other encryption can occur at the application layer, where the application controls what gets encrypted before it is stored. The deeper point is that different approaches produce different trust boundaries. Storage layer encryption often protects against infrastructure-level exposure and is easier to apply broadly, while application layer encryption can provide stronger separation because the application controls who can see plaintext. However, application layer approaches can be harder to manage and can introduce operational complexity if key handling is inconsistent. A survivable choice aligns the encryption layer to the sensitivity of the data and the need for clear boundaries during incidents. For high-sensitivity data, you may want stronger separation so that even some platform administrators cannot access plaintext easily. The exam often tests whether you can reason about these trade-offs without assuming that one approach is always best. Legal scrutiny also emphasizes policy consistency and documentation, because inconsistent decisions can look like negligence even when technical controls exist. An encryption approach should align with a documented policy that defines what must be encrypted, how keys are managed, and who is responsible for compliance. If one team encrypts customer data but another team stores similar data unencrypted, it becomes harder to defend the overall posture. Documentation also matters because legal scrutiny often asks who approved an exception, why it was justified, and what compensating controls existed. A survivable approach includes a controlled exception process with time limits and review, so exceptions do not become permanent gaps that no one can explain. Consistent policy also makes audits easier, because you can show that encryption decisions follow a standard rather than being improvised. The point is not paperwork for its own sake, but defensibility and repeatability under pressure. Incident response survivability also depends on how quickly you can change the system without breaking it, which is where key lifecycle design becomes critical. If key rotation is rare and risky, responders may avoid rotating keys even when they suspect compromise, which leaves the attacker's access intact. A survivable approach makes rotation routine, tested, and well understood so that it can be performed quickly when needed. It also ensures that key retirement and access removal do not cause unexpected outages, because outages create pressure to roll back security measures. Another part of lifecycle design is knowing dependencies, meaning you can identify which services rely on which keys so actions can be targeted. This is especially important during incidents because responders may need to isolate one system while keeping others running. A strong approach treats lifecycle discipline as operational readiness, not as housekeeping. The best encryption approaches are the ones that can be adjusted safely and quickly when the situation demands it. Another concept that matters under scrutiny is who holds decryption power, because legal and regulatory questions often care about control and access. If encryption keys are accessible to a broad set of administrators, then the claim that data is protected may be weakened because many people could potentially decrypt it. A stronger approach limits decryption power to narrowly scoped application identities and limits human access to keys, using separation of duties to ensure that key administrators cannot casually access sensitive plaintext. This also improves incident investigations because the set of identities that could have decrypted data is smaller, which reduces uncertainty and helps you determine whether exposure was likely. It also supports defensible statements like only a defined service under controlled conditions can access plaintext, which is often more compelling than encryption exists. In many legal contexts, the strength of encryption as a mitigating factor depends not only on encryption itself, but on whether unauthorized parties could realistically access keys. Clear, controlled decryption power makes the encryption claim stronger. Monitoring and anomaly detection around key usage and data access are also part of a survivable approach, because being encrypted is not the same as being safe from misuse. If an attacker compromises an identity that can access data through normal service interfaces, they might obtain plaintext while the data remains encrypted at rest. A survivable approach, therefore, includes monitoring that can detect unusual access patterns, unusual key usage, or unusual export behavior, and it includes the ability to revoke sessions and key permissions quickly. Monitoring also supports legal scrutiny because it demonstrates that the organization actively manages risk rather than passively relying on encryption. It helps show that the organization can detect misuse, respond, and preserve evidence, which are key elements of reasonable security practice. Beginners sometimes treat monitoring as separate from encryption, but in real scrutiny, they are connected because monitoring is how you prove your encryption approach is being enforced and not bypassed. When monitoring and response are integrated, encryption becomes part of a living control system. When you bring all these pieces together, choosing encryption approaches that survive incident response and legal scrutiny becomes a disciplined design exercise that prioritizes control, evidence, and resilience. You choose key segmentation so emergency actions can be targeted and blast radius stays limited. You choose strong governance and separation so decryption and policy changes are tightly controlled and easy to investigate. You ensure evidence is retained and protected so you can prove what was true and what happened, even months later. You apply encryption consistently across the data lifecycle, including backups and exports, so the weakest copy does not become the real exposure. You align encryption layer choices to sensitivity and trust boundaries, recognizing trade-offs between broad coverage and stronger separation. You build lifecycle practices like rotation into normal operations so incident response can act quickly without causing outages. You limit decryption power so encryption claims remain defensible, and you integrate monitoring so misuse can be detected and contained. This is what it means for encryption to be more than a feature, because it becomes a posture you can defend under pressure and scrutiny, which is exactly the kind of reasoning the exam is looking for.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.